We live in a time where the dominant worldview of people is based on what can be seen. If our actions can't be seen, then their value is subjective, or so it seems. As long as no one sees me, I can do whatever I want. From our perspective, it can seem that this is how the world works all over the place. That morality is relative. That right and wrong only matter in certain situations. And that right and wrong are not constants. But Jesus reveals to us this is not how it is from God's perspective. From God's perspective, everything we do is seen. And because nothing is hidden, God sees the motivation behind everything that we do. Jesus' words at the end of Matthew 25 highlight this quality of God. That God is able to discern every person's motive. And what we encounter is that following Jesus is the only process that will motivate us to do the right thing, whether seen or unseen. Following Jesus is what brings about righteousness. What we encounter is that righteousness isn't something we just magically have. To be righteous, you have to be made righteous by Jesus. Many readers of Matthew 25 have been caught up in trying to figure out the importance of the imagery of the sheep and the goats. In Middle Eastern areas, it was common to have sheep and goats grazing together because of the rough terrain that they would feed on. In this instance, sheep and goats were both valued. They were seen as the same. They were all part of the same herd. And goats were seen as producing faster than sheep. So you would end up with more goats than sheep. So they would have to pull out goats along the way to keep the herd balanced so it didn't upset the way that they cared for both the sheep and the goats. And a shepherd would easily be able to know which goats needed pulled out. With this context in mind, the imagery of this passage is more about the decisive ability of the shepherd to separate their animals. Jesus compares this shepherding scenario to how it will be when the Son of God returns to make all things right. The Son of God will gather people from all nations and decisively separate those to the right and left of God. Jesus here reframes the whole thing, right? He reframes the definition of who is a brother and sister of those connected to the family of God. And it's anyone who does the will of God. Anyone who does the will of God is a brother or sister of Jesus. It's not by birth, but by one's orientation toward God's standards. So Jesus is saying that this service to those doing the will of God is in turn serving Him. It's serving the family of God. It's serving God Himself. But Jesus refines this type of service even further by saying that this is a service done to the least of those who are doing the will of God. It's not just service to any brother or sister of Jesus. It's service to those who are considered the least in society. These are the down and out, the struggling, the poor, the forgotten people who are doing the will of God. Serving the least of the brothers or sisters of Jesus is in turn serving Jesus. In some ways, righteousness can falsely be understood in this way. I think, or at least we sometimes think of it this way, that a person is just righteous. Like, that person's righteous, this person isn't. They've just always been that way. And this person isn't, and there's just nothing they seem to ever be able to do to change that. But this treats the quality of righteousness like a birthmark or the unique sound of one's voice compared to another. Yet biblically, righteousness is something that always comes from without. A simple biblical definition of righteousness is the state of being in accord with God's standards. So bringing our life into congruency with God's standards. Righteousness is a person's orientation to what God has established as right and wrong. To be made righteous means that one's life has to act in congruence with God's standards. Theologian Stanley Hauerwas has written much on the development of character, and he describes character as the distinctive quality that a person can become. Meaning character is not a quality that a person has at birth. Character is something that a person is shaped into. And only after it is shaped into the person can it be recognized in the person. When we live apart from Jesus, we become trained to ignore the people who are needy around us. That's what a life of sin transforms us into, but not in a positive way, in a negative way. Trained by the world to ignore the family of God and God Himself. So good at ignoring God that began to do so as second nature. Our character isn't shaped by association alone. Even on the negative side, being near sin doesn't necessarily make someone sinful. But the more we indulge in the habits of sin, we do become sinful people because we become shaped into that character. On the positive side, the same is true. Simply being near God or the church or the Bible or being associated with those things doesn't necessarily make us like Jesus. Rather, we become like Jesus the more we live into and actually do the things Jesus commanded us to do. Those who do the will of God, as Jesus talked about. The more we serve as Jesus served, the more we become shaped to be like Jesus. The more we care for the people that Jesus served, the more we become like him. The more we take on the values that Jesus valued, the more we become like him. The more that becomes our character. The difference between those who appear sinful or righteous and those who actually are sinful and righteous is not always clear cut to us from the outside. Like for us to look at somebody and say, oh, that person's righteous, this person's unrighteous, it's not so clear cut for us. But for God, it's crystal clear. For God sees the whole of each of our lives. God sees our heart. God knows what motivates us. God knows if our actions are motivated by Jesus' transformation of our life, or if our actions are motivated by something else. God knows whom has been made righteous and who hasn't been. To be righteous, you have to be made righteous by Jesus. To be righteous, you have to be made righteous by Jesus.